Superman marked a before and after in the comics industry. If it hadn't been for him, characters like Batman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, Wolverine and Spawn would never have existed. Although the Man of Steel is not as popular as the Bat today, he remains one of the great pillars of DC Comics. Believe it or not, there was a time when the publisher almost lost the rights to Superman due to a problem with Captain Marvel. You probably already know the story. A comic book publisher created Captain as a copy of Superman and DC sued them for this. In the end, the House of Superman won that dispute, but due to a judge, the publisher was about to lose the rights to the Kryptonian and it almost became public domain. It all began in 1938 with the printing of Action Comics #1, where Superman made his first appearance. Although his popularity has varied over the years, the rise of Superman ultimately ushered in the era of superhero comics, one that continues to this day. Soon, other publishers noticed the popularity of this superhero, so they decided to copy this concept. In May 1939, Fox Comics introduced Wonderman in Wonder Comics #1, a character created by Will Eisner and Rick L. Phillips and who was very similar to Superman. DC was quick to file a lawsuit and a lengthy legal battle ensued. Fox Comics' defense was based on the insistence that the inspiration for Wonderman derived from the classic Hercules mythology rather than the Action Comics stories. However, the similarities were impossible to ignore. In fact, the judge presiding over the case declared that the only difference between the two characters was the color of their suits. As expected, Fox Comics lost the case and the restrictions imposed by the judge meant that the publisher could not use Wonderman again. After winning the trial, DC felt confident and believed that no one else would dare to copy Superman. No one could have imagined that DC's upcoming legal clash would cause the company to briefly lose the rights to the Man of Steel. In 1940, Bill Parker and C.C. Beck introduced Captain Marvel in Whiz Comics, a comic strip from Fawcett Publishing. From the beginning, Captain Marvel's similarities to Superman were evident. His appearance, power set, profession, adventures, and antagonists were a carbon copy of the Metropolis hero. Confident after the Wonderman case, DC filed a copyright infringement lawsuit. Thus began National Comics Publications Inc. against Fawcett Publications Inc., one of the longest and most famous court battles in comics history. Intriguingly, and perhaps surprisingly to modern experts, Captain Marvel actually outperformed Superman in terms of popularity and sales throughout the trial, initially making an out-of-court settlement nearly impossible. For starters, National Comics Publications Inc. v. Fawcett Publications Inc. was filed in favor of DC. The judge did not take long to perceive the irrefutable correlations between Superman and Captain Marvel. Furthermore, it focused on Dr. Sivana's position as a copy of Lex Luthor, while the testimonies of some Fawcett employees confirmed that they were inspired by Superman to create the Captain Marvel stories. Many took the stand to claim that Fawcett's higher-ups had flagrantly ordered them to copy Superman. However, despite this rocky start, over the course of the trial something unthinkable happened. The case gradually turned in Fawcett's favor. As expected, Fawcett maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but chaos was lurking around the corner for DC, as Fawcett's lawyers had discovered something surprising about Superman's rights. They argued that DC had waived totalitarian rights to its character, making any copyright dispute unenforceable in a court of law. To DC's surprise, this claim turned out to be true. Shortly before this trial occurred, DC had licensed the rights to McClure Syndicate to publish a Superman newspaper strip. Under the agreement between DC and McClure Syndicate, the copyright to the strips was to be owned by the latter before being transferred to DC after a period of half a year. This would prove to be the first nail in DC's coffin, as the court decreed that such an agreement would result in a joint venture, resulting in DC and McClure Syndicate sharing responsibility for upholding the Superman brand. The problem for DC lay in the fact that McClure Syndicate had played fast and loose with copyright laws. This was so profound that McClure Syndicate had not attached the copyright symbol to its comic strips. This symbol serves to indicate that an intellectual property belongs to a company or person. By not putting him in their Superman strips, they were agreeing to anyone using Superman and they couldn't object. As DC and McClure Syndicate were being treated as a joint venture at this time, the lack of opposition from the House of Superman over this practice was translated as an abandonment of the character's copyright. In other words, the fact that DC never properly regulated McClure's comics was seen as their lack of interest in retaining the Superman brand. This left DC in an extremely vulnerable place. Although the court agreed that Captain Marvel amounted to plagiarism, infringement could not be confirmed, because DC had committed copyright negligence. It wasn't until 1954 that DC scored a victory, when an appeals judge declared that the plagiarism was deliberate and blatant, and that the comics company had not relinquished its copyright to Superman. Under appeal, DC was fortunate to turn the tide against Fawcett. The judge ruled that DC's lack of action against McClure Syndicate was not enough to indicate intent. Following this new ruling, DC would have to abandon the Superman copyright in a transparent and unequivocal manner for Fawcett's argument to stand. This was in stark contrast to DC's actual conduct, as they were fighting to protect their intellectual property. Issues of Superman and Action Comics were properly copyrighted, which served as evidence for this claim. If that wasn't enough, the appeals judge was against the comic book company and McClure Syndicate being treated as a joint venture. This freed DC from being pursued for the McClure Syndicate's failures, depriving Fawcett of his greatest defense. Once DC and McClure Syndicate were no longer treated as equal business partners, Fawcett's argument was discarded. With the court now firmly in favor of DC, proceedings were launched to determine the damages Fawcett owed to DC, understandably leaving the former in a state of panic. The trial had been long and tense and would undoubtedly have resulted in an exorbitant settlement figure. Fortunately for Fawcett, this never happened and a settlement was reached out of court. The court ruled that both companies would have to review every Superman and Captain Marvel story to determine the extent of any plagiarism that had occurred. Given the money and time this would have taken, it seems likely that both sides believed that an out-of-court settlement worked in favor of everyone involved. At the conclusion of the trial, Fawcett paid DC $400,000 and agreed to never use Captain Marvel again. Although National Comics Publications Inc. v. Fawcett Publications Inc. is presented as a conflicting and dramatic moment in comics history, the story has something of a happy ending. In 1972, Fawcett signed over the rights to Captain Marvel to DC, allowing the superhero to join the Superman universe and the Justice League. Following a lawsuit by Marvel Comics, DC decided to change the character's name to Shazam in 2011. Since then, the character has gained more popularity thanks to his 2 films, while in the comics he has become one of the most great allies of Superman. It is curious to imagine what would have happened if that appeal judge had not changed the course of the trial. Maybe the rights to Superman would have been lost for a while and any publisher could have made use of the character. For better or worse, the rights to Superman remain the property of DC, and that is unlikely to change in the future. Luckily, other publishers learned from this story and managed to create other copies of The Last Son of Krypton which are not affected by copyright, which has not allowed us to enjoy great stories without the need to resort to Superman. For now, that's all for this video. In the description we will leave you the sources we use to collect this information. Tell us if you already knew this anecdote and if you would have wanted Captain Marvel to continue as a separate character in the DC universe.